Neal Ascherson, you have watched many of the big events in the world unfold over the last few decades up close. You were covering Poland before everyone else. You're here today at this Brexit convention. How do you think Brexit fits into that sort of broader story you've been writing about your whole life?
Well, I think it does fit in because, of course, I've always been involved with the story of, Britain, the UK, Ukania, whatever you like to call it, in the world, and it fits in. Well, Brexit, of course, was a great surprise. I mean, aware that England is an exceptional nation. It has a Sonderweg, as they used to say about Germany. It's not like other countries. It does its own thing, whereas Scotland, of course, is really much more like a small European country in a great number of ways. England is very special and very different. I've always been, I suppose the more you travel, the more you become aware of that, the more you report on other countries and other situations. But no, when it happened, I was devastated. I could sort of feel it was coming, but nevertheless, I was horrified, and it brought about a kind of physical, glandular change, really. So I thought, well, that morning, I really felt I was no longer British, And after all, I personally am a mongrel, I mean, I was born in Scotland, largely brought up there, but I was also entirely educated in England, so I ought to be British. And I also, my father was in the Navy, and I served in the Royal Marines and all that kind of thing. And yet, just discovered I didn't feel British anymore.
And I've got lots of friends who express the same sentiment, but I suppose for me, I've often wondered in the year or so since it happened whether this wasn't just an acceleration of the process that people like you have been describing for a long time, that Tom Nairn described in the 70s with the breakup of Britain, that the forces of decolonisation and the breakup of the British Empire led us to this eventual conclusion, the birth of the English as a nation rather than imperial centre.
Well, it would be great if that happened. I mean, if it were to be the rebirth of England, which has been a terrific nation. I mean, it suffered, as somebody just said on one of the platforms, suffered from priority, England. It got there first. Not only the Industrial Revolution, but of course England got there first with the first modern revolution, apart from one or two big upheavals in the Netherlands. But what happened in middle 17th century England was the first time that large numbers of people said, we are as good as you, we are equal. That's what society is. We ought to be equal. We ought to share everything. And no person should think that he's better than anybody else. So at that moment, the level of, the 1647 Putney debates and all that, it came so early in European history that nobody else understood it. And then it was all thrown away at the end of the century, of course. Nothing came of it. And in that sense, England has suffered constitutionally and politically from being first and not having the nerve really to carry on with the extraordinary self-discoveries that it made during the English part of the Civil War.
You're, of course, famous among other things for writing about Poland and about Eastern Europe. I don't know if you have a sense of how these things are followed there at all, or if you're still following affairs there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the attitude in certainly Central and Eastern Europe about, for example, Scottish nationalism or the Scottish movement for independence has always been, what kept you? There you were, you've been sitting there for 300 years under this system. Why did you not do what we did? And, from late 18th century on, say we want to be independent, or to, in Poland's case, to regain a lost independence. And so they find that entirely natural, that aspect of the possible breakup of the UK. At the same time, they have, or certainly had, a deep respect and affection for Englishness and London and red telephone boxes and bobbies with big blue hats and all that stuff. And they like that in a slightly ironic way. And of course, that very much applies to Germany as well. What people envy specifically in England, really, is the sense of almost monstrous continuity. This has been going on for 1,000 years in England. You know, there you still got these kings and queens doing their thing and the same old buildings. And look at German history. I mean, even our physical cities have been ground to dust several times in the last few centuries. And yet England just goes on, carefully, arrogantly perhaps, but gosh, we envy that. And there is that element as well.
And moving on to Scotland, where both you and I live, do you think that, you know, the most common question I get is, will Brexit lead to Scottish independence? How is it you answer that?
Well, my answer to that is that, ironically, I find almost everybody I talk to in England thinks, oh well, you know, Brexit now makes Scottish independence inevitable. You know, Scotland will not break away because Scotland voted to stay, and England voted to leave, and it's an insupportable situation. It's not stable. It'll break. Of course, in Scotland, it's not nearly so clear, and this is partly because of the nature of the difference in what you might call broadly unionism. In other words, if you ask a unionist in Scotland, okay, why do you want the union to go on? Why do you want the United Kingdom to go on? Why do you want to keep the link with England? And people will produce voluble and passionate replies with a lot of reasons. If you ask people here and say, well, why do you want the union with Scotland to go on anyway? And people just look at you blankly. Well, and then you know, have to think of plausible reason. It's quite striking. But it's just as striking as the fact that how many people, certainly up to very recently, combine in England, I think, a certain resentment of what they suspect Scotland to have got away with in terms of financial privilege and all the rest of it, with a feeling about, well, if they want to go, it's their right. They can go, can't they? Can't really stop them, can they? And of course, it is a remarkable situation if you compare that to the rest of Europe. If you look at the parallel Spain and Catalonia, you know, is exploring the project of becoming independent. The Spanish state says no. It says no, it's illegal, it's against the Constitution, you cannot do it. And so everybody is thinking, is there any way we can get there without a confrontation which could actually produce violence and bloodshed of some kind, which is not that far back, Spanish, indeed, sort of Madrid-Barcelona relation. Whereas in the UK, in one sense, the thing is utterly simple. All the Scottish people have to do is say, can we have it? End of story. And then Westminster says, well, we're sorry to see you go, but yes, you know, even Mrs. Thatcher said, you know, if the Scots want to be independent, they're right to go.
And so we're going into a general election. We're stood here in the middle of Westminster. One of the things we're already seeing in leaflets from the Conservatives in this election is the same as we saw 2 years ago, where the Conservative Party plays into a fear of Scots and a fear of the SNP in order to tell people they can't possibly vote for Labour. So just up in Islington, for example, there were leaflets delivered today saying just that. And I was interested in that because for me that reminds me of what you hear about elections 100 years ago and how Ireland was used and the Irish question was used by the Conservatives to crush the Liberal Party at that time. I wonder if there's an analogy there that we can learn from and that you might have some history for us on.
Well, there are certain analogies, some of which are rather threatening with that situation. One is, of course, that the SNP, with its 56 MPs over there in Westminster, never compares itself to the Irish Home Rule Party, which spent 30 years in the British Parliament with very large number, I think 100 sometimes. And this comparison is really quite instructive. It is true that the SNP MPs already have home rule, one might say. What they want is independence. And what the Irish Parliamentary Party wanted was home rule. Nevertheless, there was a process in which they got too comfortable in Westminster slowly. And eventually people in Ireland thought, well, what are you really achieving? And before, as their influence began to fade and rather ossify, they became part of a sort of routine, and they were no longer inspiring. Parnell, the great leader, was long departed the scene. And then slowly the generation which produced Sinn Féin arose. And quite suddenly the Irish Parliamentary Party said, oh, nobody wants us, nobody votes for us. Eventually they, as it were, pulled the big red handle and they marched out. By then nobody cared. Nobody cared. They went back to Ireland. Next year they were wiped out in the 1918 elections by Sinn Féin. Now, that is one of the comparisons I look back on. Whether, I'm not really sure that the Tory campaign against the Liberals back in the early 20th century about Home Rule was, well, it was effective in this sense that, of course, the Liberal Party historically split, and the idea of unionism, which is of course why the Scottish Conservatives were called unionists in those days, because it wasn't that union they worried about 1707, they worried about the Union of Ireland and the Union of Northern Ireland with the British state. Well, I don't think it's really comparable. I mean, you'd have to say, well, in that case, could the Tory party bring about some sort of split? No, what happened instead is that the Tory party has managed to attract in Scotland it looks as if they're attracting most of the unionist vote. That's a sort of a straight fight about the Constitution as it appears. That is a fight which we don't know who will win in the long run. But I would think it's extremely dangerous for a party like the Scottish Conservatives to push aside almost all other policies and say, never mind what Mrs. May is doing, never mind what Tory policy is, social welfare policy and all the rest, and on the economy, on matters like equality, education, all the rest of it. Forget all that and just listen to us about no second referendum, no independence, continue the union. That's what it's all about. That's a pretty narrow plank to fight on.
And of course we're in the extraordinary situation now where at the start of this month, which is May 2017, if you're not watching it now, the Conservatives in Scotland had a whole array of councillors elected, only with one policy, which was to oppose a second referendum and keep the UK together. These are local councillors, which has nothing to do with this, and increasingly it's turning out the people who are elected are often a parade of bigots with no other particular policies, and I suppose how that dynamic plays out with the Scottish Conservatives is going to be interesting. But I've got one final question for you before we go, which is slightly unrelated, but here at Open Democracy UK we're often found quoting something you once said, which is that you can no more get democratic socialism from the British state than you can get milk from a vulture. And I wondered if you could just explain to us what exactly you meant by that.
Well, what I meant by that is the British state structure, we would call it the Anglo-British state structure, is absolutely archaic. It got stuck in 1688 when what happened was that absolutism was simply transferred, taken away from the kings and dumped onto a parliament, which became absolute instead. As it were, the divine right of parliament. You have this weird doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. And what follows from that is that if you have this sort of executive and legislative absolutism, you can't develop a culture of human rights. You can't really conceive of such an idea as popular sovereignty, nor really can you acquire the idea of supreme law, which in Scotland has always been around. And it's a Scot, Samuel Rutherford, who wrote a famous book called Lex Rex, the law is king. said that kings, rulers, even parliaments must be subject to a law, which is what we would now call a constitutional law. So that's never been understood in England at all. Well, in Scotland it is still just kind of dimly understood by people, and the senior judges, the Court of Session, so on, understand that kind of thing, and indeed it is taught in universities that this is in some sense a Scottish European sort of tradition. Now that difference subsists. The English state, or the Anglo-British state, has with great difficulty accommodated itself to the idea of rights. And if you like, the structure of the sort of parliamentary sovereignty idea, it's like an old tweed blanket, you know, and you look at it and you can see now all kinds of little twinkles, and these are little moth holes which have appeared in it over the last 50 years. And some of them are legal. They are judicial review, which means that a court now, even in England, can say that or this decision by a government department was unjust, unfair, and it isn't legitimate by the standards of what's gone before. That's a big hole in parliamentary sovereignty. Lending powers to Brussels is another. Devolution, of course, is another. These are not rents. They're just sort of creases, really. But the whole thing is becoming difficult. Now, the trouble is really, how do you bring about what I would call a kind of modern republican constitutional situation in England, when you've got this, still this idea of power coming from the top, from the crown down through the executive, well, through a sovereign parliament which delegates it to a cabinet which delegates it to a prime minister, more or less. And how do you get the continental idea in which they say power rests with the people and it rests with the local community? But of course the local community can't do everything that it needs, so it decides to delegate some power upwards. And that in turn, the next layer may delegate upwards, and eventually you get a national government to do the things which none of the lower levels can actually achieve by themselves. And that's subsidiarity. But it's not just that complicated word, it's also democracy. It's the idea that the people are sovereign, which is something which is often said in Scotland, and which people in Scotland do believe. But the Anglo-British Constitution really doesn't allow for that. It has to be done by compromise or in effect. And you can now see, in fact, we're now in the middle of this sort of triple train wreck constitutionally in Britain, in which, because nobody knows what the law of state is, it's never really been written down. I mean, is it the supremacy of Parliament to decide whether Britain leaves the European Union? Is it up to the mass of people voting in a referendum, doing something which Parliament, if left to the members of Parliament, would never happen? The majority of members of Parliament, of course, wanted to remain. Or is it up to this third force, which is sometimes referred to as the Henry VIII legislation or Crown prerogative, which is just ultimately the cabinet can do what it bloody well likes without even asking Parliament. Now, these three things all collided, tremendous crash over the outcome of the referendum, and we still don't know how it works or what is going to come out of it, except we know that this can't go on. This is not a sustainable basis for a democracy which is responsive and which guarantees people's rights.